Yeah. Yeah, that's good. So what the editors are looking for in capital market research. So this is like very up to date. Yeah, so pay attention. So the two gentlemen on the right, yeah, Ankrist and Embens received the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2021. So just a few years ago, and they received the Nobel Prize for natural experiments. Remember we looked at the experimental methodology? Well, they got it for empirical studies done in natural experiments, and we'll go through some examples. So very interesting. Embens has like two children. They're like 10 and 8, a boy and a girl. And on the day that he won the Nobel Prize, they wanted to know what he got the prize for. So it's a very nice little video here of him explaining in very simple terms to his 10-year-old and 8-year-old why he got the Nobel Prize, right? So a couple of good examples. One was, people are always talking about the effects of giving a guaranteed minimum income. You know, so say you gave, you know, people 25,000 a year, right? And the proponents say, well, it would encourage them to follow their dreams. They don't have to worry about paying their rent or buying food. So now they might become great painters or poets or, you know, like Elon Musk, right? Travel to the stars. Others say, no, if you give people 25,000 a year, they'll just not work, right? They'll blush. So this natural experiment that they did, there's a lottery in the US that doesn't pay the 100 million like the lotteries in Australia. It pays 25,000 a year for 20 years. So they had, the treatment was the people that won the 25,000 a year, and the control was the people who didn't, matched up by, you know, age, etc., what sort of work they were doing. And it turned out that the winners just kept working. It didn't affect them. They didn't become lazy and not want to work. So they kept working. So that's an example. So all capital market studies, any empirical work you do is has a problem of endogeneity. What is causing what, right? In New York, there's a lot of policemen and a lot of crime. In Canberra, the capital of Australia, there's very few police and there's very low crime, right? So if you look at the association, what's causing what? Is the crime causing the police or the police causing crime, right? Unless you have a very clear hypothesis, you wouldn't know. In New South Wales, a state I now live in, it's fine. And in Queensland, a state I used to live in, it actually was the police causing the crime because we've had, you know, investigations into the Royal Commission. So, you know, it's not as clear cut as you think. So another example is ownership and performance. So if you have very diffuse ownership, people from all walks of life, as you know, institutions, retail investors, ma and pup investors, you know, that might lead to good performance, right? But good performance, on the other hand, might attract a really diffuse ownership. Banks with really good capital reserves might perform well, but on the other hand, it could be that good performing banks can afford to have big capital reserve. Yeah. And here's a good one. Athletes might develop lactic acid as their performance deteriorates, but lactic acid, on the other hand, it's associated with declining performance, but it might be something the body's doing to continue your high performance. And everyone thought they had to stop the buildup of lactic acid because that was associated with declining performance, right? For example, you're running a lap of the track, right? You're going fine till the first 300 meters, and all of a sudden the last 100 meters, you're struggling, and there's a lot of lactic acid in your system. Well, when they studied it at a molecular level, when the science was advanced enough, they found out that the lactic acid was actually helping the athlete, yeah? Actually helping. It was associated with declining performance if you did a study on it, but it was because it was it turned out because there was diminishing performance, the body made the lactic acid. So very interesting, studying at the molecular level. So standard regression analysis confounds, what is driving what. So you've got a problem there with causality. So the statistical fix, the econometric fix is to use instrumental variables. So if you've got a potentially endogenous variable, you use an instrument. An instrument has to have two properties. It's uncorrelated with the error, that is, it's exogenous, but it's relevant to the endogenous variable, right? And so then the IV estimator is here. The regular maximum likelihood estimator we know is the beta equals covariance y with x over variance of x. So here you replace one of the x's with z. So the IV estimator is covariance y with z over covariance x with z. And to test if you've got an endogeneity problem, you would do an endogeneity test. It's called the Hausman-Wu test. So you compare the coefficients of your regression, that's your maximum likelihood estimates, with the instrumental variable estimators, or the betas. And that's what the test does. How far are they different? Then you check the two properties of good instruments. One, that it's correlated with the endogenous variable, and two, that it's uncorrelated with the error. So coming up with instruments, right? So you could use exogenous variables that appear elsewhere in the system. You're probably not going to get many marks from the editor for doing that. You could use lag values of the endogenous variables. You're probably not going to get many marks from the editor for doing that. You could come up with economically relevant and intuitive instruments. Now, that's a lot harder to do than you might think. I've scoured the literature and I only come up with these 5, and I'm only sure of one. The one I'm sure of is the second one, the sex of the firstborn child. Yeah, that was used as an instrument to study the effect of family succession on firm performance. So if there was family succession from the founder to a member of the family, they were looking at what implications that had for performance. The instrument they used for family succession was the sex of the firstborn child. So let's look at the properties of an instrument. Number one, uncorrelated with the error. So do you think that something that happened by chance 40 or 50 years ago, that is, whether it's a boy or a girl, is related to the performance of the company now, 40, 50 years on? No, that's right. But is it correlated? Now it has to be correlated with the endogenous variable. Is it correlated with family succession? Well, yes, unfortunately, and more so in Asian cultures, if the firstborn child is a boy, then it's more likely to be a family succession, right? So it's correlated with the endogenous variable, definitely uncorrelated with the error. So that's the best of all of the instruments that I've seen. And that Nielsen there, Casper Nielsen, he's a friend and colleague of mine. He also did some other very interesting work where looked at the value of directors, and to do that, he looked at exogenous shocks, which was the sudden death of directors. And he didn't kill anyone, but he collected data on the sudden death of director and looked at what impact that had on share price. And from that, he was able to find the value of a director on average. So of course, some will be more valuable than others, but the average value of a director. Okay, so let's see what's going on. And one of the things that's been studied a lot is ownership and performance, particularly inside ownership. So now, we're able to study this here at a molecular level, right? And it turns out there's an endogenous solution for each firm for their optimal amount of insider ownership, right? So for A, if insider ownership, firm A is 3%, then that's their optimal performance. For B, If the inside ownership is 7%, that's their optimal. The C, if the inside ownership is 5%, that's their frontier is maximized. The ownership performance frontier is maximized. So you can see the equilibriums here. But A is at 3%, B is at 7%, and C is at 5%. And that's the equilibrium for each firm. Now, a Senate committee requires a study to be run on ownership and performance. And two young scholars from Chicago go out and just fit a regression, not worrying about causation. And they find in this cross-section that performance is increasing until you get to 5%, then it dips, and then they had some other firms and it might go up again around 25%, right? So that's what they found. But they're not dealing with endogeneity. So what happens if the Senate committee took that seriously and passed the law saying that every firm had to have 5% inside ownership? What happens? Well, you can see at 5% ownership, you can see the frontier for A, crosses here. So their performance is going to be way down, way down the bottom. At 5%, the frontier for B crosses, just a little bit above that, and it's got to be way down. C is fine. So you can see the decrease for A in performance and the decrease for B in performance, right? So, by making everyone have 5%, you're on average causing the firms to lose performance. In contrast, if you did your IV estimation properly, you just got a straight line, because the truth is your statistics and econometrics is not going to solve your causation problem, right? It's not going to solve your endogeneity problem. What it's going to do is not lead you to the wrong conclusion. Yeah? So it's not going to find anything. If it truly is endogenous, then you need to be studying it at a molecular level, right? So the two best papers written on this are papers by Dempsey, and he points out if there's endogeneity, then there's nothing you can do about it if you're using cross-sectional returns. So Coles, Lemon, and Meschke said, they agreed with that. And they said, well, look, we've got to study it at a molecular level. So they went out and assumed a theoretical model with principal agents, principal maximizing the utility subject to, and, the owners are maximizing utility subject to the principal also doing okay, looking after their best interest, and Cobb-Douglas production function. And they calibrated the model to each firm, and they were able to find the labor productivity and compare that to the insider ownership. And the insider ownership was higher where the labor productivity was highest. Things like software, networking, computers, right? And insider ownership and labor productivity was lower, and things like utilities, metal mining, and so on. So how do you go about dealing with endogeneity? Well, essentially, you've got to do a natural experiment. If you're not doing an experiment in the lab, you have to do a natural experiment. And this paper in the Journal of Financial Economics is a really good roadmap. So it's a paper on debt and taxes. So there's been a lot of studies on debt and taxes, over 1,000, but this is the best one, right? So it actually goes out and gets a whole lot of exogenous shocks. That's the natural experiment. So in the US, there's state taxes as well as federal taxes. Yeah, and the state taxes can be quite substantial, 7% to 12%. So they went and got all the yearbooks for each state and for taxes, and they collected all the tax increases. Yeah, and there was 38 across 25 states. Remember, there's only 50 states, so that's half the states, and a couple of thousand firms. And that was split pretty evenly between the 90s and the 2000s. And there were 67 decreases in 29 states, so way more than half. 7,000 firms, again, split between the 80s and 90s and 2000s. So then they do a really good job of showing that the shocks were endogenous, right? Exogenous, right? They compare firms in different states, but just across the state lines. And they're all performing pretty well, right? The same prior to the tax change, right? So the change had nothing to do with the state of the economy in the state. Yeah. What they found was as taxes go up, firms increase the leverage, right? And we'd assume that on the basis of theory, right? Because the higher the taxes, the bigger the tax write-off you get for having debt, right? But they also found that when the taxes went down, the firms didn't decrease their leverage, right? What I'd say to that, though, I think it's very easy for a firm to increase their debt. They just issue new debt. For a firm to reduce their debt, they have to pay off the existing debt. And most debt is held to maturity. The people who bought it want to hold to maturity. So probably if you wanted to decrease your debt, you'd have to wait to the maturity of that debt before you decide not to issue additional, the replacement debt. So anyway, outstanding paper, a deal with endogeneity, do a natural experiment around an exogenous event. Most people just have one, but these guys found over 100 of them, the tax increases, tax decreases. And debt and taxes have been studied for many years, but with no real resolution, right? Whereas this gives a very sharp and clear resolution, right? So it's probably the most sensible paper written in this area. And it gives you a really good roadmap for your own design, right? The treated firms are the ones that had the tax change, yeah? And the control are the ones that didn't have the tax changes, right? And you're able to see the effect of the tax change on their debt after the tax change. So if you want to do it in statistics, it's called difference in difference, right? So you have exogenous events, yeah? So you define a time dummy that's after the exogenous shock. You define the treatment dummy, which is tax increase or decrease. So then you run a regression with time dummy, a treatment dummy, and interaction, which is time times treatment, right? And that's where the money is, right? You're very interested in that interaction. That is, did the treated firm have a different outcome after, the time of the intervention, yeah? So B3 is what you want to look at. And you also have controls. So that interaction is the effect of tax change on post-tax change in debt holdings. So in doing this, you've got to consider, Hyder and Lindqvist wanted to make sure the effect was exogenous. So what they do now is they do something called parallel trends. That is, before the change, before the treatment, were the firms you're studying on parallel trends? Doesn't mean they were doing the same, but whatever difference between them was, it was not changing over time. And then you look at, once treatment, how do they change? One might go up and the other might stay the same. Yeah? So they want to have parallel trends prior to. The other thing that editors want you to look at is take account of multiple time periods. So Hyder and Lindqvist, it was the 90s and 2000s. So a lot could change. A lot of extraneous events that we talked about with, the actual experiments could occur in 2 decades. Things could change. So what they want you to do is something called staggered diff and diff, which means you get the coefficients for each period, and then you somehow average them, right? So you either average them equally or according to the number of events, or that is, the number of tax changes here in this example. So that's something important to look for. So, and the editors for a while were happy with that, right? They were happy with you doing a natural experiment. But now they have started to refer to the natural experiments condescendingly, looking down on them, as reduced form estimation. That is, you're not running a model, you're just running outcomes against explanatory variables. You're not saying how the explanatory variables affect the outcome. So they call it reduced form. Yeah. So now, in addition to showing that X causes Y, doing the diff and diff. They want you to fit a theoretical model, right? So that's called structural estimation, yeah? So they want you now to, once you've shown causation, they want you to fit a theoretical model so they can ask what if questions, yeah? The outcome's a function of these explanatory variables and these parameters. What if we change the parameters, yeah? And they can do social experiments. So, and a good example of this is Briggs. And again, it was another lottery they were able to study. So this lottery they were looking at, it was a European country. You either got 150K lump sum or monthly installments. They were interested in the 150 lump sum, yeah, 150,000. So did that result in people, being more likely to invest in the stock market, right? So they did a different diff, yeah, and yes, they were. They were 12% more likely to invest in the stock market if they got this windfall gain. And so that's great, right? But that's not enough, right? So that showed causation, but then the editors wanted more. So they said, well, look, we want you to fit a theoretical model. So in economics, there's a model called the life cycle theory, right? So as young people, they find it very hard to borrow, and do anything. And in fact, there's a famous paper by Constantinides called Junior Can't Borrow. And it's sort of saying that the marginal investor, the person that can make investments, buy a house and everything, is a middle-aged person in their 40s. Yeah? So junior can't borrow. So the economics has got a very clear idea of the life cycle and what you can do in different stages of your life cycle. So here, the structural estimation was fitting a life cycle model. So then they were able to look at whether the people who won the lottery invest in the stock market, but they're able to do it as a function of the parameters of their model. Yeah. So they're able to see how much they invest in the stock market, where they invest in the stock market was driven by each of the parameters. And they're able to do policy experiments. What happens to the outcome if we change the parameters? So the editors are looking not only for the different diff, which they call reduced form, but then they want you to fit a theoretical model. And I'll give you some examples of the theoretical models that have been used. Yeah. So we know the Coles, Lemon, and Maschke is a good example of sort of studying at the molecular level. They fitted the principal agent production function. With the production function, you can get the labor sensitivity, the capital sensitivity. Pan, and Z did a production function. Whitehead, Wu, and Z did a structural industrial organization, or an IO, demand system. Whitehead is the editor of the Journal of Financial Economics, and she goes around proselytizing that you have to do the reduced form and the structural estimation if you want to get into the top journal. Yeah. And we just looked at Briggs, which did the life cycle model. Yeah. So that's some examples. Now, a lot of people were spending money on environmental. So there's a model, a general equilibrium model, known as an environmental stochastic dynamic general equilibrium model that models consumers, producers, government, right? So you can introduce things like a carbon tax, yeah? And then you can play around with whether that revenue from the carbon tax or emissions trading scheme is recycled into the economy, right, as R&D incentives and or tax breaks. So great lectures here from Tony Whitehead. They're hours long. They're 3 hours long. So there's more than you ever wanted to know about reduced form and structural estimation. It goes through a whole lot of papers in great detail. Yeah. So what are the editors looking for, right? Well, it's best not to do two-stage least squares, right? It's best to do GMM. Editors think that two-stage least squares is so last century, right? So it's best not to do that. But if you do GMM, it's just the same anyway, except you estimate everything at the same time. You don't do two steps, you just do one step, but you get the same estimates. They'd be happy if you use intuitive, economically motivated instrument, but that's really hard to do. They'd really like a natural experiment where you do diff and diff. But in addition to that, which they call reduced form, they want to see a structural estimation where after you've done the natural experiment, you now fit a theoretical model so they can ask what if questions, right? So capital market research has got very demanding. Where can you find these natural experiments? Well, whenever there's an exogenous shock, right? So, you see a lot of papers from China, appearing in the top journals, right? That's because when China wants to do a policy, it first does a few pilot zones. So it wants to do an emissions trading scheme. It rolls that out in 5 provinces. Yeah. So you can look at the treatment firms, which are in those 5 provinces. You can look at the control, which are other provinces that are matched to those 5. And you can do a diff and diff, right? You can do your natural experiment. And then for your structural estimation, you could use that environmental stochastic dynamic general equilibrium model, right, that I talked about. Now, that's just software, right? That's just software. So, you might look around in Vietnam. What sort of measures has the government done which, come across as an exogenous shock, but affects some parts of Vietnam, but not others, right? Because remember, you need a treatment and you need a control. So most people thought before Haider and Lindqvist did their paper that there wasn't a treatment and control, that they just looked at federal taxes, right? But Haider and Lindqvist looked, outside the box and said, well, the state taxes as well. So let's find when, some states change and other states don't. And we've got treatment and control. So you've probably got to do some lateral thinking to come up with these natural experiments. In failing that, you can do a systematic literature review, as Shalini told you, or you can do a qualitative study, you can do an experiment, you can do a survey. You can't do an empirical study, a capital market study. There's lots of other ways to do it. So it's a good idea to have these research methodologies, in your tool kit as a researcher. So that's the whole idea of what we're doing with these workshops, and the whole idea of what Knowledge Bridge is about. Okay, we stopped that one. So now we're going to go to, and I'm going to tell you what page. Get this down. What the editors are looking for. That's a Word doc. Okay, getting published. And I'll tell you what page that's on. Page 351. I worry about knocking the microphone over. Oh, you might have to stay here too, because I've got to get a share screen. And I've got to get the display right. Okay, sharing the screen. Sure, that's right.
It's number space 351.
351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 351. 51, yeah.
The option is the different one, right?
Should be the same.
Yeah, okay.
They'll tell us soon enough. Right now, you've got to get the display here right. Come back. Come back, I'm gonna need you. Okay, so I want to share. I've just got to find the right thing. Hang on, we've got to affect the display.
Fine.
Flipping to what the editors are looking for. Yeah,
Yes, this one.
yeah.
Okay.
Oh, no, getting published. Then I'll come back to what the editors look for. So now when I do this,
We should.
yeah, it's shared now, but now, the display we need to fix.
Do you want slideshow, right?
See this thing? We just wanted to have this. Don't want that. This is what the Zoom people are seeing. They're seeing the two. We don't want them to see what's coming up because that's confusing. They just want to see this.
Yeah.
We need to fix the display.
Em trên Zoom là có đang check hai màn hình hay là chỉ slideshow thôi? Cái cột. À,
There we go.
có cái cạnh đúng không? Là thôi, cái cột, các slide. À vậy hả? Let me, yeah, I think it's the option when we share. Get to screen two. So which means that they only see the presentation.
I think they're seeing what I see. You only see one? You sure?
They just see this.
You
not
sure?
this.
Okay.
Yes, I just asked the Zoom.
Okay, okay,
Chỉ thấy một màn hình thôi đúng không? Okay, it's okay now.
thank you. Although it doesn't seem to be progressing from